presentation by Jessica McCordick. So I hope Jessica is with us.
Yes, I'm here.
Okay.
I'm just trying to share my screen now.
Okay, the title is Monitoring Vessel Use and Characterizing Acoustic Species Assembled in the Soundscape of 2 Australian Marine Parks. Go on, please.
Okay, can everybody see my presentation?
Yes.
Okay. I'll hope everyone can see it. So today I'll be talking about a collaborative project between Parks Australia and the Passive Acoustics Research Group at NOAA Fisheries Northeast Fisheries Science Centre, looking at the soundscapes of 2 Australian marine parks. Australian marine parks represents a huge network of marine protected areas, or MPAs, and this network is incredibly complex, and it's managed regionally, and among regions as well as within each of the regions. There's a very complex structure where the MPAs vary in size and scope of management. The network itself, as I mentioned, is quite large. It's over 3 million square kilometers and covers just over 1/3 of all federal waters of Australia. Within each of those marine protected areas, they do have varied management goals and levels of protection specific to the particular cultural and natural resources that they're aiming to conserve. But all of these parks, just like all marine protected areas, are generally aimed at improving biodiversity and minimizing anthropogenic threats. Monitoring these marine protected areas does present challenges, both conceptually due to their complexity, but also logistically due to some of the factors listed here. So inclement weather, availability of light, so nighttime observation is very difficult in the marine habitat. Access to these sites can be prohibitive since some of them are quite remote and far offshore, as well as visibility. So again, with light levels and weather, influences visibility, but another factor is simply the fact that these environments and most of the relevant processes are taking place underwater, where visibility is quite limited and can be very difficult to directly observe what's going on. So because of this, we turn to passive acoustic monitoring, and we're specifically looking at soundscapes. And soundscapes, again, interpolate biophony, anthrophony, and geophony to create this entire picture of all of the sounds occurring in a particular area. In the marine habitat, this can be done remotely and autonomously by deploying recorders, such as the one in the oval in the center of the screen. And this essentially picks up all of the sound and can record continuously. And so it helps us circumvent some of those logistical challenges. Soundscapes themselves are at risk. So in addition to being an indicator for other processes, the soundscape intrinsically is also at risk in these protected areas and elsewhere. In the marine habitat, increasing anthropogenic noise is a huge issue, whether it's causing masking of communication signals. Climate change is, of course, a huge problem. In the marine environment, this tends to manifest as degrading physical habitat, particularly in coral reefs, as well as ocean acidification affecting, again, reef structure, but also the communication of some marine invertebrates. Additionally, directly removing species through fishing activities can influence the soundscape if those species happen to be acoustically active, as well as direct removal of species. The fishing activity itself can also affect the physical habitat, which can in turn affect the soundscape. To monitor these soundscapes, we looked at 2 small marine parks off of the east coast of Australia. We looked at Solitary Islands Marine Park and Cod Grounds Marine Park. Now these we used as kind of a pilot study to do a proof of concept study on whether soundscapes would be a good monitoring tool for this environment. The parks, as I mentioned, are quite small, so we're confident that most of the recording range of the recorder can capture the sounds within the park. They are also national park zones, which means that it's a higher level of protection within the park system. These national park zones do allow vessel transit, but they do not allow extractive activities such as fishing or mining. We deployed the recorders 3 separate times at each site, ranging from 33 to 69 days per deployment. These recorders did give us a relatively continuous recording throughout that period. And it also gave us a look at some seasonal differences as we were able to record in the winter for our first deployment, the summer for the second, and the autumn season for the third. Using these recordings, we wanted to look at hourly presence of some different sound sources. Now for monitoring, we're mostly interested in the relative contributions between the biophony and the anthrophony. And so after some preliminary analysis, as well as looking at the literature to see what we might be finding in these parks, we selected 6 examples of biophony, as well as 1 example of anthrophony. So our biophony were dolphins, dwarf minke whales, humpback whales, fish chorusing, snapping shrimp, and other baleen whales. And some of those have example spectrograms here. And then our single anthrophony source was vessel passages through the park. Using hourly presence, we were able to look at seasonal patterns. So this plot is showing each of our sources in each row. Time cumulatively is going across the x-axis with our 2 parks in each column. So essentially the vertical axis is showing you time of day. So that tells you kind of when things were present during the day, and differences across your x-axis are showing seasonality. So in terms of seasonal patterns, we mostly saw seasonal patterns in our baleen whales. So humpback whales and minke whales showed the strongest patterns, with humpback whales present primarily during the winter and autumn and nearly continuously during that time, and minke whales present primarily during the autumn. We did have 2 instances of minke whale calls in cod grounds in the winter, but again, most of that presence was happening in the autumn season. Our other baleen whales were pretty infrequent and sporadic and didn't really show any patterns, but we did note their presence. Other sources showed diel patterns, or patterns throughout the day. So these sources were consistent across seasons, but again showed differences in time of day of occurrence. So we saw nocturnal patterns with dolphins kind of present in those nighttime hours. Our fish chorusing was very consistently around dawn and dusk, showing that crepuscular pattern. And vessels were primarily occurring during daylight hours. So there were some nighttime vessels, but the majority of our vessel activity happened during the daytime. And as you can see in this plot, the vessels were happening throughout all of the deployments fairly evenly. I didn't forget about the snapping shrimp. They were present pretty much throughout all of the hours, throughout all of the deployments. So they were kind of our most consistent source and just sort of there all the time. After we had these hourly presence metrics, we wanted to look more at soundscape measurements. So we looked at the power spectral density of each site by season. So in this plot, the seasons are indicated by color, with the winter season being the blue line, the summer season is orange, and the autumn season is in black. Now for these plots, this bold line kind of in the middle is showing the median or 50th percentile, and this is suggested to represent typical conditions. The shaded areas are showing the difference between the 5th percentile and the 95th percentile, and those are an indication of the difference between essentially quiet ambient conditions and less frequent, louder events. So one of the patterns that we noticed in these plots were the large peaks here centered right around 300 hertz. We also noticed that the winter and autumn deployments were a bit louder than the summer deployment overall. And that pattern kind of followed up into your 95th percentiles. There's additionally another peak in the higher frequencies here, as well as some noisy peaks in the higher frequencies present only in the winter deployment. When we compared these to our spectrograms and looked at the frequency ranges of our sources, we were able to identify the sources of some of these peaks, and we found that the main seasonal difference was happening because of the humpback whale song, as well as fish chorusing. So the fish chorusing continued throughout all of the seasons, and so it just also contributed to the energy levels in the winter. But the main difference was in the seasonal differences in the humpback whale song. That secondary peak in the higher frequencies was attributable to the snapping shrimp between about 4 to 10 kilohertz. And then we did have, there was apparently an underwater mooring chain of some kind near our recorder in the winter season at cod grounds. And so we saw, that's what those kind of short, infrequent, but loud sounds were. We also had this peak up here, which is a low frequency peak, and we weren't entirely sure what to attribute that to. There were some consistent low frequency peaks or low frequency signals in our recordings that we couldn't quite assign to any anthropogenic or biological sounds. So those will remain unknown for now. In Solitary Islands, we saw a very similar situation with, again, that larger general peak right around 300 hertz. We have this mystery peak right around 30 hertz, and then our snapping shrimp at the higher frequencies. Yet again, we were able to attribute these higher peaks and these seasonal differences to the presence of humpback whale song, as well as the sort of cumulative effects of fish chorusing. In Solitary Islands, we mostly saw the fish chorusing in the summertime show up in that 95th percentile, with, again, generally much more quiet conditions in the summer. When we looked at our diel trends using a different metric, so for our diel patterns, we looked at broadband sound pressure level. And so this is showing overall pressure level or loudness as it relates to time of day throughout the entire recording. So this is time, energy per time summed over all frequencies. And both of our sites showed these peaks right around dawn and dusk. And if you recall, with our hourly presence, the only source that also showed consistent presence at dawn and dusk was our fish chorusing. So we are, again, pretty confident that the fish chorusing is driving those peaks at dawn and dusk. The other sources that showed diel patterns were, again, the dolphins, which were essentially nocturnal, and the vessels, which were concentrated during the daylight hours. And so we didn't actually see any peaks related to either of those other diel sources, indicating, again, that the fish choruses are really what's driving this pattern. And just another way to sort of visualize the soundscape of these parks. So this is an example of a 48-hour long-term spectral average taken from Solitary Islands Marine Park in the winter. And this kind of, I love these plots as just a way to put it all together. So this is a pretty typical 2-day period in this park where you can see the fish chorusing. Our snapping shrimp actually were also contributing to that crepuscular chorus, but they don't show up in the hourly presence data because they were present throughout all the recordings and all the hours, but just increased their amplitude at dawn and dusk. We did have an event, you can almost see it. There's a little bit of dolphin activity here. The humpback song is very, very present down in these lower frequencies. And there's a very short vessel passage here. So kind of again, putting this all together, you can sort of get to see where those metrics are kind of showing up and what you can and can't see using the soundscape metrics. So what we found, again, was that the soundscapes in both parks were dominated by biological sources, despite having consistent vessel presence throughout the parks. Our two overview soundscape metrics did provide an efficient indicator of temporal changes, and we're hoping that managers can use tools like this as a first step to start to look at changes over time and changes and differences among various marine parks. And with that, I'd like to thank all of you for listening, as well as thanking all of my co-authors, and I'll take any questions if there's still time.
Okay, I replace Giusy Buscaino for the chairman job, and I thank you for your great presentation on marine soundscapes. You are very perfect in time, but we are a little bit in advance on the scheduling, so we have plenty of time for questions. Any hands raising, showing up to make questions? I have one. In your recording setup, you record continuously or on a scheduled basis?
So the winter recordings were continuous, and the summer and autumn recordings were on a 30-minute duty cycle. So they recorded for 30 minutes and stopped for 30 minutes over that whole time. So that's part of what accounts for the difference in total length of the deployments. So our shorter deployments
yes,
recorded
of course.
continuously.
Okay, thank you.
Here's a question from Marta Bogen.
Jessica, can you read the question?
Yes, I can.
Okay.
So Marta is asking, do we know which species were emitting the fish chorusing? We actually don't know to species. We think that one of the choruses is most likely some type of toadfish, but we're not able to identify the species. We tried to kind of look in the literature and didn't come up with anything that looked quite right. So that would be, an excellent next step would be to try to validate some of those choruses to get to the species level, maybe using underwater video or something like that.
Maybe I have missed the information during your presentation, but what type of equipment did you use?
We were using sound traps.
Okay.
So it's an acoustic, kind of a self-contained acoustic recorder and battery out of New Zealand, I believe, is where they're made.
There is another question from Brian Lopez.
So the SPLs were calculated for the entire frequency range. So our recorders were recording at 48 kilohertz sample rate, so from 0 to 24 kilohertz. It could affect kind of what we're looking at. So another approach might be to compare SPLs calculated just using those lower frequencies and see if we could pick up vessel activity that way. It could be that the fish chorusing and snapping shrimp might just be swamping out with those higher frequencies.
Okay, any more questions?
I think there's one more if we have time. Yes, so the question is, how did we detect all the sound sources in our recording? So we did primarily manual review of spectrograms, but we did use an automated detector for dolphin whistles. We're looking at using more detector-based approaches just to make the whole process more efficient for that part.
Okay. And did you observe a relationship or a negative relationship among vessel traffic or specific vessels noise and the acoustic expression of your environment?
We weren't really looking at that fine scale. I mean, anecdotally, when the vessels are coming through, it's just this massive noise, broadband noise on our recordings. But looking through the spectrograms, I didn't notice any direct effects. You know, if there was humpback song happening, it seemed to still be happening. Same with the fish chorusing. But there were definitely some masking issues with the spectrogram. So when the vessels, if there was a close vessel, it also gets harder to detect and see those other biological events.
Okay. And I have not seen any trace of echo sounders on your spectrogram. Often we see lines at 12 kilohertz or 15 kilohertz or something like that. That depends on the echo sounders on the boards.
Yeah, we didn't see anything from, are you talking about echo sounders from vessels themselves?
Yes.
Yeah, we didn't really see any of that. I'm not sure if maybe the boats there aren't using them, or maybe they're higher than 24 kilohertz, but we didn't see any.
Other questions? Almo?
No, Gianni, was just to signal the question on the chat.
Okay. So there are no other questions. So I thank you, Jessica.